Mises, I had the great privilege of studying under him. He was a magnificent person, both in his mental achievements and his personality, and I want to talk about both today. Mises started off in the great grand old days of pre-World War I Vienna, the last great civilized whatever that's been seen, I think. And one of the great things about him, by the way, personally, was he was full of anecdotes of the old days and what happened and who said what to who, and it was just charming. He grew up and he started in the University of Vienna in the seminar of the great von Bauwerk, one of the masters of the Austrian School of Economics, and he was one of the shining stars in the seminar, and became quite radical in it, because he came to the conclusion that you can apply subjective value theory and marginal utility theory not just to the so-called microsphere, terrible word, but I was sort of stuck with it, not just to the microsphere of individual actions in the market and prices and production, which of course is very important, but also to the sphere of money, which had for a long time been totally separated. It was really in 19th century English economics, or British economics, that we started this big separation between the microsphere over there and the macro over there. The macro, you deal with money and gross national product and all that stuff. And of course, in standard economics, there's no connection between micro and macro. You take a micro course and you learn about how, more or less, how good the market is, with a lot of exceptions. And supply and demand clears the price system and so forth and so on. It works pretty well. I mean, generally conceded, the market works pretty well. And in the micro area, and you get a point where, for example, within the Communist Party, not in the United States, but places where they're really doing things like Hungary or something, it's the economists in the Communist Party who are much better, much more free market oriented than everybody else. I mean, it's that sort of shift. At any rate, but the macrosphere is supposed to be is talked about totally separately. When you get to the macrosphere, they talk about the velocity of circulation and things like that, gross national product, growth rates, seemingly with no connection with what was going on in the micro course, where the individual and the interrelations between individuals were dealt with. So Mises is the first one, at least since early 18th century Catalan in France, to integrate, to believe that they can be integrated, and started doing it. And so his first great work, Theory of Money and Credit, came out in 1912, takes the subjective value theory, the marginal utility theory, and applies it to the sphere of money and general price level, general prices. It was not accepted even by his fellow Austrians. They thought this was going too far, you can't do it, too radical, etc., etc. And so, which he started doing just by example, first by example, and secondly by his own private seminar. Interestingly enough, I'll get back to this a little later too, Mises never in his whole life had a paid university position. He was certainly qualified for it, to say the least. I'll get back to his American experience a little later on, but even in Vienna, he lost out. There was only one professor, I think, in Vienna, one paid professor. He lost out on this to somebody who was a more orthodox type, who did not integrate it with the money supply, the theory of money. And so he had his private seminar. He worked for the Chamber of Commerce, which in Vienna, and did a lot of work which has been lost, of policy studies and things like that, advice to the Austrian government. He was the one, by the way, apparently, who stopped the Austrian inflation from becoming really runaway. This was in the early 1920s. It was a very severe inflation, something like Argentina now. It never got to the hyper runaway stage, but Mises almost single-handed prevailed on the government to stop it. So he was always an activist as well as a theoretician. And he had his private seminar in Europe in those days, maybe still, I don't know. You can be at a university unpaid and have a private seminar, and it was considered quite prestigious. It was not like not like here. You have an alternative university or something. You rent a room in the university. It was a prestigious post, except it was unpaid. So of course, which is important. And it was in that private seminar where people flocked from all over Europe, including England, to study under him, because the reputation became enormous. His reputation became enormous. So first thing he did was integrate subjective value theory and Austrian economics in general into the money sphere. And then by the end of his book, he really starts applying it to business cycles. He was the first great business cycle theorist because the phenomenon of business cycles had been discovered for a long time and analyzed and so forth. Nobody could quite figure it out. Because if a market tends toward equilibrium, tends toward a situation of full employment and everything clears and so forth and so on, how come there's always business cycle? How come there's booms, several years of booms always succeeded by several years of bust? And so there are all sorts of wild theories. For example, Stanley Jevons, who was quite good economist in his own right, had a sunspot theory. He believed that because the sun changes or whatever, this causes problems in the wheat crop. This somehow causes the business cycle. So a lot of nutty theories came up because they couldn't figure out anything else. So Mises first of all realized that it can't be a market phenomenon because the market, everything is tending toward clarity and people learn from their experience and so forth and so on. And he began to realize it's really the intervention by the central bank and the money sphere that generates business cycles. And he works out the outlines of it in his theory of money and credit. From then on, he starts developing that. During the 1920s, he develops a whole more elaborate theory about how business cycles are caused by government intervention in the banking system, generating inflation through the central bank, and thereby causing malinvestment, or causing unsound investments, which the recession has to liquidate. See, the result is that the recession, even though, of course, pain in the neck, becomes an inevitable and necessary conclusion to a boom. In other words, once you start the boom process, the inflationary boom, which causes unsound investments, they have to be liquidated. So the recession process becomes the adjustment process. It's the method by which the market reasserts itself, the free market reasserts itself, so that you wind up after the recovery with an efficient system benefiting the consumers in the best possible way. As a result, the way to stop a business cycle, both the recession and the boom, is to stop the central bank from generating inflation, from expanding credit. The way to do that, of course, is to abolish the central bank. I mean, it's the easiest way to do it, or the simplest way, let's say, not politically easy. Short of abolishing the central bank, you chain it down, forbid it from doing anything, that sort of thing. So early in the game, then, Mises really reconstituted the approach of the money supply becomes a key factor, both in inflation and in business cycles, almost single-handed. Unfortunately, in the scholarly world, and this is still true, by the way, nobody reads a foreign language. Okay? We all pass, to get this PhD, even now you have to pass the language test. I think 2 languages, at least 1. And it's true, we all pass it, and it's all fake. I mean, nobody knows a damn thing. It's the sort of thing where, first of all, they allow you to have a dictionary. Okay? And so if you study German, let's say, for a couple of months, you can sort of parcel it out. And you can flunk it. I know somebody who flunked his French test about 3 times before they finally passed it. And obviously, you forget it the next day. And once you pass it, it's like, whew, that's over with. And so as a result, nobody, especially in England and the United States, where we're all English chauvinists, nobody reads a foreign language. This meant that Mises' book, not having been translated until the mid-30s, in other words, it took almost 25 years for somebody to translate this theory of money and credit in English. Nobody read Mises, and nobody then has never got absorbed into the English-speaking world. It got absorbed into the continent, into Austria particularly. And so it was translated really too late. By the time it was translated, Keynes comes along, the whole thing gets swept aside. I'll get to that in a minute. But so this problem of translation became a key point in the transmission of ideas. As a matter of fact, one interesting thing was, as an aside about the great Keynes, Keynes reviewed the book for the Economic Journal, which was the great prestigious journal in England, Economic Journal in England, still is. So Keynes reviewed the theory of money and credit. He says, well, it's an interesting book, but it hasn't got anything new to say. It's an interesting textbook on money. It turns out later on, Keynes admitted, I think his biographer admitted it, that Keynes didn't know German. This book was, he reviewed a German book, right? And, or to put it this way, he knew enough German to understand something which he already knew, but he didn't know it enough to understand a new idea. Okay, so here this SOB says there's nothing new in this. So anyway, this as a result, Misesianism, so to speak, didn't penetrate to the English-speaking world until it was really too late. finally, what happened was that, well, first of all, Mises was one of the few people in the 1920s to forecast the Great Depression. So this is not the orthodox position then was, well, it's a new era, as the Republican administration called it here in the 20s. We have a new era because we have a Fed now. This was the orthodox line, a mainstream line. We have a Federal Reserve System, and they can correct everything. They can pump money in if they see prices are falling. They pump money into the system. If they see prices going up, they take money out. They can fine-tune the economy so they can iron out the business cycle. And it was the pre-Friedmanites, by the way, who were saying this. Irving Fisher, sort of the pre-Friedmanite. It was the big guru economist in the 1920s. He's sort of equivalent to Samuelson or Galbraith now, I guess. And his position was, this is great. We've now ironed out the whole business cycle because we have a Fed. So when the stock market crash came and the 1929 depression came, first of all, Fisher wrote a book in 1930 saying everything is great, everything's in great shape. There is no depression, there's no crash. It's just a slight blip in the new era. And because the theory was if you look at the wholesale price level, and it's not going up, it means there's no inflation. Of course, Mises had said just the opposite. You don't look at the wholesale price level, you look at money supply and credit, because prices should be falling. In a free market capitalism, prices tend to fall. As for example, computers and penicillin and TV sets have fallen dramatically. So what usually happens under free market capitalism is prices tend to fall. And if prices are not falling, there's something wrong. In other words, the Fed or the central bank is pumping in too much money. This will create a business cycle. And of course, he turned out to be right. So he was predicting this sort of phenomenon. As a result, his views became very popular in Europe after the Great Depression came, after 1929. It then happened that his major student, Hayek, went to the London School of Economics. Lionel Robbins was a big shot at the London School, had studied under Mises in Vienna, and absorbed a lot of Misesian thought and brought Hayek over. And Hayek then brings the message of Austrian business cycle theory and Misesian business cycle theory to England. At one point, he had converted all the top young economists in England, all the guys who are now later became big shot Keynesians. And so it looked very much as if Misesian theory would then penetrate to the United States and take over the English profession. What then happened was the Keynesian Revolution, which comes out and swept the board, it was like a revelation from on high. And all these people converted back to Keynesianism, who knew better, by the way. They were following the zeitgeist. They had their finger to the wind. Okay. So, because one interesting thing about the way Keynes took over, it's not that the Keynesians refuted the previous people. You know, when you read in the textbook about how science develops, you read that, well, everybody patiently tests their hypotheses, and then they confirm them, refute them, and new hypotheses come in. This is all baloney. It almost never happens, especially in the social sciences. And what happens is it's like a fashion comes in, a new wave of the future comes in. And suddenly everybody dropped Austrian theory and shifted to Keynesianism. And there are various explanations for this. One is intellectuals were looking for big growth in statism, and this is the way to do it. And two, of course, the governments love the idea that deficits are great. Governments always love it. Right now, whichever party's in power loves deficits. Okay, the only people against deficits are those who are out of power. So the governments took the Keynesianism like a duck takes the water. This is great. We finally have an economist who's in favor of big spending, public works and deficit spending. Because before Keynes, most economists, regardless of whether they were right-wing, left-wing, whatever, were against the deficits. And so suddenly this guy comes along as a very distinguished economist and says, no, this is the wave of the future. Deficits are great. So at any rate, so this kills Misesian theory in England. So by the late 30s, it's all forgotten, just sort of swept under the rug. And of course, with the rise of Nazism and the war, it's more or less going, at least temporarily, in Europe. Anyway, while this was going on, while Mises was developing a business, integrating microeconomics with money and developing a business cycle theory, he was also doing something else. I mean, doing many other things at the same time. Socialism was coming in after World War I. As a result of World War I, socialism began to sweep Europe. And Mises came out with a famous article in 1920 showing the real problem of socialism is not the usual problem, who will sweep the streets and who will take the garbage out, which is a problem. The real problem is that socialism can't calculate. They wouldn't know what the hell to do. The Central Planning Board wouldn't know what to produce where. and where to set up a steel plant. Should it be in Novosibirsk or in Omsk or whatever? There's no rational guideline to plan. Therefore, the whole thing is, would just be a total failure. And Mises started a great debate in the socialist thought about whether or not governments or central socialism can calculate. They sort of accept it now. I mean, after many years, when I was going to college and graduate school, the theory was Mises has been refuted because Oskar Longa, the great Polish Marxist, had shown that if you had perfect conditions or whatever, the government could act as if they were the market. And sort of you tell your managers, be the market, be market. And then they go out and Mises, of course, showed that wouldn't work either. And in practice, of course, it hasn't worked. And there was one interesting phenomenon where one thing that Mises said is that the only reason why socialism works at all right now is because there's a world market out there where they can refer to the prices. It doesn't work it works very badly, but at least there's a world market. They can say, okay, the price of steel is such and such, or cement, or whatever. And a noted English economist visited Poland. This is in the 50s. He asked the Polish economist. That's at the time when central planning had hit its stride, and the Polish communist economist admitted that they refer to the world market. That's how they can do anything. And so this economist said, well, look, if socialism takes over the whole world, which you're presumably in favor of, what would you do then when there is no market left? He said, well, we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I got a great answer. Anyway, so Mises showed in the early 1920s that socialism can't calculate, and that's what converted Hayek, by the way. Hayek had been a socialist before that, read the book, and he was converted to free market. And then he showed that interventionism doesn't work either, because interventionism, for example, has a cumulative effect. Price controls don't work. Taxes cripple savings and investment, etc. And each intervention sets the conditions up for another intervention to try to cure that, and that doesn't cure that, but creates conditions for more intervention, etc., until you wind up with socialism, which doesn't work either. So what we had then was as a result of all this, a carefully built, constructed case for why the market works and why government doesn't work. In the meantime, he also had a methodological fight. Mises was essentially the one who invented the concept of praxeology. Actually, the Austrians had been doing that before, but he pointed out what the method is. It's making deductions from self-evident axioms, or axioms which people would read to as soon as they understand it. And he had a big methodological battle with other people, with positivism, etc., etc. And finally, he developed, after setting the agenda for methodology for how economics should be constructed, he finally did it with human action. In other words, he just, okay, first he says, here's how you can do it, and then he finally does it. Where human action presents the whole doctrine, the whole thing, how the market works in intricate detail, and why government screws things up. So this is a fantastic achievement. It's just an unbelievable achievement. I don't sling around words like the greatest, like some people do. I think Mises is certainly one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. I think no question about it. While he was doing all this, while he was doing this fantastic scholarly and theoretical achievement, he was also battling on the activist front, and political activism. I already mentioned how he was sending advice to the Austrian government and helped stop the inflation. He also constantly battled for laissez-faire, pure laissez-faire system. Of course, during the 30s in particular, this was getting more and more out of fashion, to say the least. But nothing ever stopped them. It was just amazing. I mean, fiery, intransigent, uncompromising. And the more the climate became socialistic and statist, the more he battled openly and frankly for laissez-faire. I remember when I was getting interested in economics in the 1940s, and friends of mine who later did the same thing happened to them, we tried to find one economist who said openly he was in favor of laissez-faire, and we couldn't find it. There were all sorts of conservative economists then. And they would say, yes, the government shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. There's always a chapter, either the last or the first chapter, where he says, of course, I'm not in favor of laissez-faire, that's reactionary garbage. Government has to plan, blah, 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 blah. And then we say, nuts. Can't we find one economist who says openly he's in favor of laissez-faire? And of course, Mises was it, and still, almost still is it. The only one who says, frankly, he's in favor of laissez-faire, all the way, no compromise, and spells it out. And battles for it. Mrs. Mises is a remarkable woman in her own right. We just had a tribute dinner for her. She gave a speech. She's frail and ill health. She gave a rousing talk. And she said that Mises was an activist of the mind, and she stressed the fact that she attacked Austrians who want to divorce themselves from the real world and to only talk about pure theory, never talk about political questions. She said, that's not what my husband's views are. My husband's, was an activist. And in addition to all that, especially in his earlier work, when he dealt with questions of imperialism, for example, Mises was a flaming anti-imperialist. And I recommend his writings as Liberalism and Nation State and Market on that. He got to one point where he said each individual has, well, first he said every group has a right to secede from a state apparatus they don't like. If they want to get out, they should have the right to get out. In Europe, of course, is a big question. Should the Serbs rule the Croats, for example? In Europe, there are hundreds of nationalities, ethnic groups, each of whom hate each other's guts, and usually with good reason. So many of them want to get out, form their own country, etc. And he said, yes, they should be allowed to do it. In one discussion, he said, well, every town should have a right, every village should have the right to secede if they want to. And he almost got to the point of anarchism when he said each individual should have the right to secede. Then he stopped. He said, well, of course, that would be impractical. And that was the end of the discussion. But it was a fascinating discussion of that. He also bitterly attacked imperialism. I want to read this to you, one quote from him, because this stuff is sort of, nobody talks about this anymore. None of his modern followers. Quote from Mises, no chapter in history is steeped further in blood than the history of colonialism. Flourishing lands were laid waste, whole peoples destroyed and exterminated. All this can in no way be extenuated or justified. The dominion of Europe, of Europeans in Africa and important parts of Asia is absolute. It stands in the sharpest contrast to all the principles of liberalism and democracy, and there can be no doubt that we must strive for its abolition. This was written about 1919, 1920s. Mises is a person. As I say, he was intransigent, uncompromising, etc. He was sweet and charming in person. It was very interesting because, well, those of us who were going to meet Mises, either studying in a seminar or any other circumstance, we usually quaking in our boots. Here's this guy's lashing out at all the enemies, all the bad guys, and we figure this guy's a fiery monster. Great on the great side, but lashing out constantly. He was a sweetie pie. He was always trying to encourage, charming and courteous, always trying to encourage students to do research, throwing out research projects, even students who are obviously clunks who never do any research. He was always trying to encourage them in doing this. And one great statement, which I've written about, but I think deserves mentioning here, in order to put people at their ease in the seminar, I mean, these people didn't know anything. Most of us didn't know anything. And here's this great man, a tremendous amount of knowledge and erudition. He said, look, he wanted to stimulate questions or comments. He said, look, don't be afraid to say anything, because whatever you say, regardless of how idiotic it is, some eminent economist has already said it. Marvelous, I love it. And of course he was right. I mean, not only was this funny, he was also correct. And he's always trying to encourage us to to speak up and say what our position was on things, etc. He's also full of, I'd say, great anecdotes. There's one charming one I remember. Those of you who are philosophically inclined particularly appreciate. He was walking along the streets of Vienna. Of course, in Vienna, everybody walks all the time. It's a great city to walk in. Even I walk in Vienna. I usually don't walk. I usually take a cab 2 blocks, being an inveterate New Yorker. At any rate, and he was walking with Max Scheler, who's a distinguished philosopher from Germany, and they were attacking logical positivism, which was coming in there as the big new thing. And which then, of course, took over the philosophic profession and ruled it with an iron hand for about 30 years. Its iron grip is only now beginning to fade. And Scheler finally, who comes from Berlin, finally said, well, look, Lou, what is there on the climate of Vienna? What is there in this place, the climate of this place, that breeds all these damn logical positivists? And Mises gave it, I think, a typical reply from Mises. He says, shrugs his shoulders, said, well, look, Max, in Vienna there are now 2 million people, let's say. And of the 2 million, about 12 logical positivists. So it can't be the climate creates them. So this is typical Misesian wit. And another great story I'll tell you about Mises, another great anecdote. He was, after World War I, there was a communist regime in Hungary for about 6 months, 6 very bloody months, the Bela Kun regime. And Mises was representing Austria in a trade treaty with communist Hungary. And Karl Polanyi, the famous left-wing sociologist, I guess you call him, and was the representative from Hungary. And so Mises said he and Polanyi used to walk around Vienna and talk about trade and something. Both of them realized, of course, the Bella Kun regime would fold in a few months. And the whole idea of Polanyi was to prolong the negotiations so he could stay in Vienna and get the hell out. So they had a fine time just sort of just BSing in general until the Kun regime dissolved and Polanyi was safe. So such is the history of diplomacy. At any rate, when Mises got to, he was of course driven out of Austria. His library was burned by the Nazis. And when Hitler began to take over Western Europe, he fled through the Spanish route to the United States. He came here without a penny, and at that time, during and after World War II, every communist, Marxist, semi-Marxist, Leninist, whatever, refugee was immediately awarded with great academic posts. Full professor at Harvard, step in, so and so. Because Mises couldn't find any academic post. He never found a paid academic post in his life, in the United States in particular. And finally, they had to settle for a consortium of businessmen. Well, it started with Leonard Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education, and a consortium of businessmen paying for a salary at NYU. So he was always a visiting professor. He visited there for about 20 years. And never got paid by NYU. And not only that, but NYU was very nasty about him, because the dean kept telling people, don't take this guy's courses, he's reactionary, crazy, whatever. And so here he was, totally scorned by the establishment, to say the least. In those days, you have to realize the intellectual climate in the United States. This is during and after World War II. I was in Columbia Graduate School then. There was hordes of people in graduate school, enormous. Everybody's on the GI Bill, and they're all afire with a new world a-coming. And the big argument on campus was, should you be a Communist Party member or not? That was the big moral problem, say. And those who were not Communist Party members were left-wing socialists. So there was the debate on campus, you see. And in that climate, Mises was totally ignored, almost obliterated, and his name never came up, except to say, in graduate school, for example, well, Mises thought that socialism can't calculate. We've now proven it can. That was that's it. That's all he did, and it sort of takes care of that. Fortunately, I met Mises through Fee, and they told me at Fee, well, Mises is starting a seminar at NYU, and his book he's coming out with a new book. So I said, what's in the book? And I said, everything. That's human action. Of course, they were right. And then he started. And the thing is, even though he was totally, obviously depressed about the world situation, and scorned by everybody, ignored, etc., etc. Always very cheerful, never bitter. It was just amazing, just magnificent. And so he took the whole thing in good spirits. Even though in his autobiography, which is called Notes and Recollections, written in 1940 in despair while he was fleeing Europe, he wrote and he said he never thought he thought he'd be advocating reforms or whatever, and he didn't realize he was going to be an historian of the decline of civilization. So he was, I say, always very cheery and never upset, and just a magnificent. Just magnificent. He was a great role model as well as everything else. A personal role model for everybody. When he died, Ralph Rako, his former student, mentioned to me that the great quote from Shelley's Adonais, the elegy on the death of Keats. And I just want to read you this one stanza, and I think it applies to Mises beautifully. And he is gathered to the kings of thought, who wage contention with their time's decay, and of the past are all that cannot pass away. So I think, and I think it's a wonderful tribute, and I think it applies to Mises. Just one more thing, one more statement about Mises. He's universally beloved in what we can call the free market movement loosely, and his very name resonates with affection. One interesting example of that was some years ago. I was at a dinner party for friends, about 8 or 10 people. There was a whole spectrum of what could be called the right wing, I guess, in those days. libertarians, rationalists, right-wing Catholics, etc., etc. And one guy decided, the host, I guess, decided, well, we should toast somebody before we start dinner. And so somebody suggested Burke, and us rationalists said nuts to that. Somebody said Paine, and the traditionalists said phooey on Paine. We couldn't think of anybody to toast. And there was a great danger of the dinner getting cold and no food. And as you probably can guess, I'm pretty serious about the food question. So finally somebody said to Ludwig von Mises, they said, of course, and unanimous enthusiasm, and we toasted Mises. I give you that toast right now. Thank you. Questions, comments? I think we have a few minutes for that. Nobody? No anti-Misesians here? Yeah.
Was there any relationship between von Mises and Ayn Rand?
There was. It's kind of intricate. They knew each other, and of course Rand recommended Mises' books. Although she always said that don't read the first half of Human Action because it's philosophically unsound. So they knew each other. They didn't get along too well, as you might expect. Two strong-minded personalities that worked. But they had sort of a distant relationship, I would say. I think it's the best way to describe it. And I think they respected each other in their various spheres. I mean, he liked Atlas Shrugged as a novel. So it was a good way to spread the message, etc. And so I think that's about it. Yeah.
What interaction did Bill Friedman and Ludwig von Mises have?
It was pretty rugged. So they didn't like each other too much at all. As a matter of fact, another great story: the founding of the Montpella Society, which was it's now a huge, swollen society of everybody to the right of Galbraith, I would say. But it started out with about a dozen people, of free market economists, basically, and scholars. And Mises and Friedman were at the founding, and Hayek and Rupke and people like that were the founding conference of the Montpella Society. It was called Montpella Society because it was held up on a mountaintop in Montpella in Switzerland. And anyway, apparently there's one great story. I've heard about 4 or 5 different versions of what actually happened there. So, it's a little, but Mises was aghast at the social philosophy being spread there because, Friedman, for example, was in favor of a negative income tax. In those days, a progressive income tax to boot. And many of the other people there were also. And finally, at one point, I think it was on a tax question. I think it was the idea of progressive income tax. Mises got sore and flung his pencil down the table and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and walked out. And Friedman likes to tell his story as an attack on Mises and showing what an extreme doctrinaire dogmatist he was. I blotted my own copybook with Friedman many years ago, and he told this story at an Austrian economics conference, by the way. He was invited to be the keynote speaker for some reason which I could never fathom, Friedman. And since he's very strongly opposed to it. Anyway, he told the story about how terrible dogmatic Mises was. And when he said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," I applauded. Of course, Friedman then denounced me from the pulpit as being typical sort of person he hated and that sort of stuff. And our relations have not been very warm since then. So they did not get along very well at all. That's, I think, the upshot. Yeah.
Murray, I'm a college student. I've yet to see any mentioning. I used to work at a bookstore. I looked through all the economics textbooks.
Right.
My boss wasn't looking. Trying to find any mention at all about Austrian. I looked in the index under A, under Mises, under Hayek. No mention at all. And Rothbard,
No, I'm never mentioning, of course. No, there's a little bit.
Not even a sentence.
Yeah, there's a little bit.
How long do you think it'll be until
No, there's a little bit now. Samuelson, whose textbook is no longer the best-selling, but still probably the most famous one, mentions Hayek. I think he might mention Mises even. First of all, he mentions them in the socialist calculation debate. Because now they're beginning to realize that maybe socialism really can't calculate after the flopperoos of Eastern Europe, etc. And also, I think Samuelson mentions Hayek on capital theory. So it's not quite that bleak. There's a little bit popping up here and there. As a matter of fact, current textbooks now mention libertarianism, by the way. There's now, it's great because there's usually a section called Radical Economics, okay? And that's the new shtick. And most of it is, of course, on Marxism and left-wing Marxism, right-wing Marxism. There's usually a paragraph or two on libertarians, being the opposite pole. And Rothenbrenner, by the way, his latest textbook, who was very smart. I mean, he's not a no sense of free market person, but he has a pretty good section on libertarianism, and distinguishes between that and objectivism and so forth. I mean, it's pretty good for somebody from an outlander. It's pretty damn good. So I mean, it's beginning to pop in now. It's not in great shape, and some of the textbooks, Bayard and Leahy, have intermediate price theory or macro and micro textbooks. They're now sort of semi-Austrian, so they slip it in a little bit. So you can't have an Austrian textbook because no college would use it. So what they do is they slip it in. They slip in, like, at the end of the usual baloney. They say, on the other hand, Hayek points out this really doesn't work, etc. So it's so it's beginning to sneak in. And as somebody said once, once an idea gets incorporated in a textbook, it's there forever. You can never blast it out. So it's not. Yeah, you're mostly right, but there's hope. I think. I mean, the last few years, I think there's been a slight shift. They're beginning to think now that we're respectable. We're another group. Also, they use us as a token against the Marxists. So that you get to a point where the department really is in favor of academic freedom, which is quite rare, by the way, despite all the noise. We'll have one Marxist and one Austrian or one free market person, so to show they're really sort of balanced. In the old days, they only had one Marxist. That was the balance. So things are improving. An academic front, yeah.
Let's say you're a high school senior who's thinking about studying economics in college.
No.
Is it, and let's say that generally you're of your school, the Rothbard school. Would it be preferable to go to a college where they teach Austrian economics so you can learn what's right? Or maybe would it be preferable to go to a standard school so, in effect, you're learning what everybody else thinks?
No, that's a tough question. It really is, because it's usually a question: do you want the prestige that goes along with a Harvard or Yale, whatever degree, or do you want to get the true stuff from a non-prestigious school? And there are arguments either way. It really depends on one's temperament, I think. I mean, I frankly think it's better to go to a prestigious school and suffer through all this stuff and know what the other guys are saying than go to a school which has no reputation. But I mean, it's done both ways. One of the problems with going to Harvard or Yale, etc., is the kids begin to get brainwashed in the wrong direction. We begin to lose part of the cadre, so to speak. But that's I know I would pick the prestigious school myself, because one of the reasons you go to college is to get the prestige. I mean, learning is only a minor element. So I mean, everybody has to answer that for themselves, really. I think that's the point. Actually, the college situation is not that bad. There are now a lot of colleges which have at least one Austrian, let's say. The problem is really graduate school, where the establishment really locks in, because that's where you train future economists. And that's much more difficult to crack, the graduate school question. We're beginning to crack that now, too. There are now places in graduate school you can actually learn Austrian economics, but that's a tough road to hoe. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you agree that government intervention is responsible for all business cycles, or might a totally free market also have cycles?
Well, I think there'd be fluctuation. There wouldn't be any cycles. There wouldn't be the traditional boom-bust, malinvestment, unemployment, and all that sort of stuff cycle. I think that's the government. There'd be fluctuation. I mean, for example, there'd be a 7-year. Let's say you have a country which is plagued every 7 years by locusts. Okay, and every 7 years, everybody gears up because they know that the locust is coming in 1988. And so you'd have fluctuation. In other words, the locust fighting industry would start gearing up a year or two before that. And after the locust comes, they sort of disappear. I mean, that's a cycle. And there's no problem with it because everybody adjusts ahead of time. So there would be fluctuation. There'd be fluctuation in individual industries, obviously. I mean, the firms, which there is all the time, the firms which still make adding machines. When I was going to graduate school, for example, they used what was called calculating machines, big, clunky, 500-pound things, which bang away, you get a multiplication in about 3 minutes, okay? Those firms that stuck to that and didn't shift to calculators or whatever, computers, have gone out of business. In other words, there'd be fluctuations within the market, obviously. As new things come up, old things become obsolescent. But there wouldn't be any real cycle. There wouldn't be massive unemployment, any large scale, things like that, or massive bankruptcies. spreading throughout the system. Yeah.
How would you explain to the misinformed how abolishing the Federal Reserve would be in their best interest and how the money and credit system would work?
Well, it's difficult to explain how the money and credit system would work. I mean, that's it's easier to explain why it wrecks the system. I mean, I don't think that's that difficult. You point out the Federal Reserve prints money. Okay, they're legalized money counterfeiters. They're legalized counterfeiters. If I print money, I go to jail for a long time, by the way. I mean, nobody worries about my upbringing. I was deprived of playgrounds as a youth and came from a broken home. None of that stuff applies to counterfeiters. Counterfeiters, they crack down on. They zero in. They find them, they catch them, and they suck them away for 30 years. Those counterfeiters do something serious. Anyway, they're interfering with the government's monopoly of counterfeiting. So I think that's not. I think it's fairly easy to point out. It's difficult to explain exactly how the Fed does it. That's a very technical thing, but it's just to say, well, they counterfeit, and that's what they do, and that causes inflation and distortions in production. And the reason why there's a chronic inflation because now the Fed can counterfeit at will. In the old days, they couldn't. So I think that's pretty simple. There's an interesting backlog of anti-Fed sentiment in the United States. There's a whole subculture of people who hate the Fed, usually for pretty good reasons. So that's so that starts off with a good climate of opinion. Yeah. Anybody else? Huh? Yeah. I can't see. Okay, over there, corner.
The problem though is, doesn't any private banking system that has fractional reserve banking, which is almost the bank is going to operate for profit, has to have. Most likely, it's going to play the fractional reserve game. Unless there are some industry-wide or some sort of standards set by some association, doesn't that cause everybody playing a different fractional reserve ratio, cause an inherent inability of the system that has to require some sort of standardization by some association, be it a private, just like the best reviews and companies. But I mean, the system we had before the Fed, though, still had regional booms and busts.
Yeah.
Because of this problem with individual private.
Well, that's a very complex question. The Fed, before the Fed, we had a quasi-centralized system. It had a national banking system. So the only really approximation of freedom of banking was before the Civil War, between 1833 or whatever, one of the exact date when the bank in the United States was finally smashed, until the Civil War. And there were problems with that. It wasn't really free. A lot of regulations and stuff. First of all, I think banks can easily survive 100% reserve. Now they have the money market funds and things like that. I mean, these are great new instruments: certificate of deposits, CDs, and money market funds, where the banks can, you lend the bank money for a certain specific length of time, say 6 months or whatever, and you know it and they know it, and there's no fraudulent aspect involved. That's great. You don't need any reserves at all for that. All you have to know is in 6 months you should get the money ready, as the thing fools do. And fractional reserve, I personally I consider this is a big argument within the Austrian camp, still raging. I personally think fractional reserve banking is fraud. Okay, others of my colleagues think it isn't. I think in the free market it would really either disappear or be of minor importance, because the hard money banks could always call upon the crummy banks for redemption. Okay, we're collecting your bills, pay up. This would put them out of business pretty fast. In the pre-Civil War period, there were people called money brokers who would collect the notes, say, of the Bank of Oshkosh, of printing money like mad, promising to pay in gold or silver. Of course, they didn't have anything. And the money brokers would collect all this stuff in the East, let's say, schlep over to Oshkosh, and present the $50,000 bills. If they weren't shot by the local gendarmerie, which is often happened in the pay of the banks, the banks would go under. And then now, of course, it's much easier to do that. You have electronic transfers, etc. You don't have to have some kind of horse riding 3 days to get to the bank. So nowadays, it'd be much easier to bust them. And my own solution to the problem as a 100% reserve person is, well, if you just have free banking, there'd be anti-bank vigilante leagues, which would make sure propagandizing on the TV. That bank is bankrupt. Go get your money out fast. This would be enough to kill it.
Well, we could go on all morning happily, but then we would have to go on all afternoon and the evening to get our other business done. Right. So I want to say thank you, Murray.
Thank you, Tony. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.